What's going on, guys? Dare here with Fantasy Football Advice, coming at you with another fantasy football video. Today, Week 9 starts and sits at the wide receiver position. We're going to go matchup by matchup. We'll let you know which players you should probably leave on the bench and which ones you should be fighting to put in your lineup. If by the end you're still unsure who to start and sit, you can always utilize the rankings available on our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. Link for that's in the description box below. But we have a lot of matchups that we have to go over, so why don't we get right into it. The first matchup that we have is the Philadelphia Eagles versus the Chicago Bears, and the Chicago Bears find themselves in a really good spot this week. The Eagles, they rank dead last in points allowed to the wide receiver position. So Allen Robinson, he still ranks inside the top 20 on the season and should find himself in a position to have one of his best games of the season, if not his best game of the season. Starting him as a back-end wide receiver 1 is possible, high-end wide receiver 2 more likely, but regardless, there's not that many players that we would expect to start over him in such a great matchup like this. As for Anthony Miller, even Taylor Gabriel, you're pushing it with that. Even in a good matchup, they're just not getting consistent volume, and it's unclear to us exactly who is going to be that guy to score, if any. On the Eagles side of things, don't be afraid to start Alshon Jeffrey. I know it's the Bears, and the Bears, they always scare people when you're talking about their defense, but it hasn't been exactly as good as advertised, and it's easy to overlook Jeffrey in this matchup because he's coming off of 2 poor performances, but just keep in mind those performances were against Dallas and Buffalo. Dallas has been very stingy in allowing fantasy points to wide receivers throughout this whole year. In Buffalo, you don't need me to tell you their defense is spectacular. So it's like he's going to have his best game out of those 3 matchups. Considering him a wide receiver 2, still too risky. Put him in as a flex though, you'll be a-okay. Texans and Jags, and we love this spot for the Jaguars and Minshew. Houston has not been able to stop the pass all season long, and specifically more towards the wide receiver position. Minshew himself has been pretty fire. We know D.D. Westbrook's been banged up though. He left last week's game. He's logged limited practices, so don't be surprised if he does start this week, and if he does, you could put him in sort of flex territory, but risky because he's not 100%. He definitely could be forced out of the game once again. Chark, however, he had 12 targets last week, has 6 touchdowns on the season, so we have him ranked as a back-end wide receiver 1, regardless of who's starting, Minshew or Foles. For Houston, DeAndre Hopkins, expect a good performance from him. If you have him, you're starting him. No need to go any further into that. And with Will Fuller injured, you're thinking Kenny Stills. He really disappointed last week in a better matchup. He's still a better start than a lot out there. Put him in as nothing more than a flex, but one you know could disappoint your lineup. We're not starting any other pass catchers outside of that. So we'll move right into the next matchup. Redskins versus Bills. Unfortunately for Terry McLaurin, who's definitely on a tear for the first half of this season, he finds himself in a matchup in a really tough spot against the Buffalo Bills. They're going to be on the road too. It's going to be cold in Buffalo. Being a 9.5 point underdog sounds good on paper when we're talking about having a game script with passing in the second half and in the fourth quarter, but considering that the over-under is 37 points and they're expected to lose by 9.5 points, Vegas doesn't expect there to be much scoring on the Redskins side of the ball, and we can't expect that either. Volume and ability will keep him as a high-end flex, low-end 2, but he's going to carry more risk in this matchup than he normally would, so if you do choose another option over him, we can totally understand that. Buffalo side of things though, we have John Brown, who had a really poor performance in a very comfortable matchup against the Philadelphia Eagles, who allowed the most fantasy points to wide receivers heading into that contest. So a lot of people have to wonder, can you trust him in this matchup? It's not as good as the Philadelphia Eagles, and it has a low point total, and we understand those concerns. Even with that though, he had 8 targets on the game, and normally if you give John Brown 8 targets, good things are going to happen. So we're more likely to toss last game up as more of a fluke and feel comfortable starting him this week as a high end 2. Only other receiver you could consider starting is Cole Beasley, but in a game with such a low projected point total, going for a guy who's more volume based, it's going to be a bad idea. Leave him on the bench, and we'll move on to the next matchup. Vikings versus Chiefs. This game's going to be an Arrowhead. Vikings, they haven't been playing very well on the road, especially outside and against solid teams. So it's really tough to determine what is going to end up happening when it comes to Stephon Diggs and Adam Thielen from a production standpoint, because we have Mahomes who could play, couldn't play. It would be better for the receivers if he does play because it would force more of a shootout mentality. However, at this point, we just can't be sure. But assuming that Patrick Mahomes is out, we'll have both of these players as high-end 2s, granting the player with more upside being Diggs in this one. But with Mahomes in of course, give them a bump up. Same idea on the Kansas City side. Tyreek Hill, he's a wide receiver 1 when it comes to rankings, regardless of who's starting. So the only other receiver worth mentioning is Sammy Watkins, who had 8 targets last week. So there is potential for him to have a good game. This team has been beatable, especially from the wide receiver 2 position, and he's coming off playing 86% of snaps. Just keep in mind, he's a wide receiver 3 at best, and your best bet is to treat him as more of a flex. Moving on, we have the Jets versus the Dolphins. Has a 42.5 point projected point total. Jets surprisingly come in as 3-point dogs. They're on the road. The Miami Dolphins, they allow the 6th most points to fantasy wide receivers, and theoretically that would be much higher if teams always didn't gain a lead against them and just run it out in the second half. But considering this game is theoretically going to be a close one, in fact Miami with a lead, passing in the fourth quarter is much more likely. So a player like Robbie Anderson is going to find himself in a good matchup. He's been very inconsistent though, so trusting him still a bit risky even in this one. I myself am a bit higher on Robbie Anderson than most, not just for this week, but overall I'd say. He's coming off of a matchup against Jacksonville and New England in which he definitely disappointed, but if there was 2 touchdown upside, I'd say it would be in this one. Our rankings though don't reflect the rose-colored outlook that I'm listing here. We're talking a back end 3, high upside flex. Just know that the floor is definitely one that could hurt you. Jamison Crowder and Demaryius Thomas, they're also guys who've been getting involved in this offense and playing pretty good. We're going to rank them below Robbie Anderson, but not even a full tier, so if you want to start them over him or potentially get those guys in your flex as well, I'd say they have a higher floor, lower ceiling, but it's very possible that you have better options than all 3 of these players. On the Miami side, Devontae Parker, high-end 4, low-end 3, in that same area in range as the Robbie Andersons, as the Jamison Crowders. New York Jets, their pass defense isn't good, but are we really trusting Devontae Parker now? I don't think so. So how about we just move right into the next one, which is the Colts versus the Steelers. And this one's actually a very interesting matchup when you're thinking of how the Steelers intend to get a win this week. They're at home, they're underdogs, only by 1 point. But for most people, it's really difficult to see their path to success. For me, I think it's pretty obvious the short passing game is going to be their best bet. Jalen Samuels likely the starter. Stay tuned for updates on that. For the receivers though, Juju Smith-Schuster is going to have to step up and in a big way if they have any shot of potentially winning this game. He's coming off of a spectacular performance, but again, that was against Miami. 9 targets. It's decent, it's strong, but it's not as if he's been force-fed targets while Ben Roethlisberger's been out. He made the most of them last week though, 103 yards and a score. This matchup though, this defense is going to be much more difficult. He still does rank inside of our top 20. We're a bit lower on him, I'd say, than most. However, starting him as a wide receiver too is definitely okay. Just keep in mind, Indianapolis may seem like a secondary that is beatable, but the reality is they've been feasting on those lower tier passing offenses, and while they've been allowing a lot to the higher end guys, they've been playing pretty consistently all season long. As for their offense, as for their receivers, we have T.Y. Hilton.
It's looking as though he's not going to be playing in this matchup, which unfortunately doesn't mean another receiver is going to get all of that work, all of that volume. It's a downgrade for the offense. The other receivers are still risky, so it's a situation you probably just should avoid altogether.
There's no more news in this one, so we'll move over to the next one, which is the Tennessee Titans versus the Carolina Panthers. 42-point projected point total, with Carolina at home as 3.5-point favorites. Tennessee's passing offense has been much better under Ryan Tannehill, and in this matchup, we can expect a lot more of the same. Tannehill himself, though, threw for nearly 203 touchdowns, which does bode well for the potential future of these wide receivers. A.J. Brown, he's a bit of a question when it comes to if he's going to play or not. He's dealing with a groin injury, so continue to monitor that. Corey Davis, though, A.J. Brown, high-end 4s, low-end 3s at best, which means you could put him in your flex. Just understand there's a little bit of risk in there. On the other side of the ball, though, we have DJ Moore, Curtis Samuel, and these guys are definitely more playable. The volume's been there. They've been performing in matchups in which they should. The ceiling, it's a little lower than we would expect, but the floor's been pretty decent, so mid to low end 3, definitely a good slot for them. We're not starting any other players outside of those guys, so the Detroit Lions versus the Oakland Raiders. This one's going to be playing in Oakland, and it has an extremely high projected point total of 50.5 points. 50.5 is actually the second highest on the week, so playing players we wouldn't typically play or increasing their projection in the rankings, those are the typical outcomes. We have Oakland actually favored by 2 points at home, but it's a good passing script for the Detroit Lions throughout the entire game. Kenny Golladay, he's been performing extremely great in easy matchups. In this one, it's going to be a good matchup for him. The Oakland Raiders have been much better against the run than they have been against the pass, and that's actually the strength of this offense now that Kerryon Johnson's out. So Kenny Golladay, he's got the volume. He should be in line for a very good performance, so we have him ranked as a mid-grade wide receiver 1. Marvin Jones, he's got a pretty decent chance to score himself too. Back end 2, high end 3. That's where we have him ranked. One player we don't
typically mention is Danny Amendola. Quietly, he's coming off of 2 good performances, averaging 8 receptions and just about 100 yards. It appears he's taking up some of that work in the short passing game that Kerryon Johnson left behind. So if you start him in the flex this week, you could definitely do worse. And for Oakland, Tyrell Williams, he may not have as easy of a time as you think. Remember, he's going against Slay. We still have him ranked as a wide receiver 2 just due to how solid he's been while he's on the field. The real player who's getting most of the work done in the receiving game for this team is Darren Waller, who's basically a top 3 guy every week and should be treated as so in this matchup. Not much to say outside of that for Oakland. So we're moving into another one which has an extremely high projected point total. In fact, the highest on the week. It's the Tampa Bay Buccaneers versus the Seattle Seahawks. 52 points. Seattle's at home. DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, they're both guys you should play. We're talking wide receiver 1s and wide receiver 2s here. You don't need me to tell you, Tampa Bay's been giving it up all season long. As for the Tampa Bay receivers, same thing. I mean, you're going to start your Mike Evans, you're going to start Chris Godwin. They're legit wide receiver 1s as well. And with 52 points projected to be scored, there's a lot of upside here too. Browns at Broncos, and I'm not particularly excited about getting any of these receivers into my lineup. It's not that they're not startable. It just feels like the type of game to disappoint from a fantasy perspective. For Denver, Cortland Sutton, he has been phenomenal before and now after since Emmanuel Sanders has been traded. Start him, mid-range wide receiver 2. That's a reasonable expectation, and that's probably where we would put Odell Beckham as well. He just really hasn't been performing up to his ability, and until we see that turn around, we can't really rank him higher than that because then we're just expecting the production going off name value, and that is not what you want to do in fantasy. For Jarvis Landry, we have him ranked where we do every week, which is just inside the top 40, outside wide receiver 3, more as a wide receiver 4 based on volume. Could he have a good game? It's a possibility, but what's more likely is just his typical handful of receptions, low yardage, and no touchdown. The next matchup is the Packers versus the Chargers, and Aaron Rodgers has been playing very well lately. Devontae Adams, he logged in a limited practice, which is much more than he's been able to do so far since the injury. The chances of him playing are real. However, we're still not sure as of right now. He would be wide receiver 2 or wide receiver 1 for that matchup because he would be matched up against Casey Hayward, which is one of the toughest in the league. But him being in or out is going to impact the rankings of these other players. Regardless though, don't trust either Geronimo Allison or Marquez Valdez-Scantling in your lineup at this point just because A, it's a tough matchup, and B, they've been wildly inconsistent as players themselves. So a flex if anything. Keenan Allen though, Green Bay's been underrated when it comes to expectations and defending the pass. They're actually the 8th best defense when it comes to passing DVOA. They're top 12 when it comes to fantasy points allowed to the position. So even though Aaron Rodgers is likely going to keep putting points on the board, forcing Phillip Rivers to likely do the same, we still can't expect this to be one of Keenan Allen's best games. So ranking him as a back end 1, low end 2 is more likely where he's going to finish. And Mike Williams, he's a back end wide receiver 2 for himself. So now we move over to the final game of the Sunday slates, which is the New England Patriots versus the Baltimore Ravens, and I'm really excited to see this game. It's going to be in Baltimore. New England's favored by 3, which isn't all that much when you think of how well they've been performing this season, so it is a credit to Lamar Jackson and this offense of the Ravens. We know their defense, it hasn't been playing very well, so offensively, Vegas does project them to put up some points. Marquise Brown, if he plays, throw him in as that high-risk flex player. He doesn't need a ton of volume to perform, but remember, this is the Patriots defense, the best in the entire league, so don't get too excited. He's also coming off an injury, but he did return to practice this week, so that bodes well for his availability. No other players outside Mark Andrews you should be interested in fitting into your lineup, but I will say, if anyone, Andrews does have the most upside. For the Patriots, you have Julian Edelman, who in this one, he's a wide receiver 1. There's no Josh Gordon, there's Mohamed Sanu, of course, and then really there's just Philip Dorsett. So if you can take a guess on who's going to eat, that's right, it's probably Julian Edelman. And don't forget that game against Cleveland not too long ago, where Jarvis Landry, in a very similar role, completely demolished them. That's the type of upside he has in this game. The other two, it's hard to really rank them very high. They're outside of flex territory. They're really more of reaches, but if you must, we have Sanu over Dorsett. Nobody else in this game we're interested in putting in. There is one more matchup though. This is the Monday matchup, Cowboys versus Giants, NFC East showdown. This one's going to be played in New Jersey, so Giants are at home. Dallas is still favored by 7.5 though. It has a 48-point projected point total. Sterling Shepard, he has a chance at playing this week, but make sure you have a backup plan even
even if it's looking good, because this is the Monday night matchup. You're not going to have many players to choose from, and it's going to have to be either a Giant or a Cowboy. What does that mean for the offensive players, though? It's really unclear. We haven't seen what Sterling Shepard is going to do with Golden Tate, so he's still a risky start. Tate as well is a risky start. So the only one you could seriously trust is Evan Engram. Darius Slayton, it's a no-go for him, considering there's just not going to be enough targets, and Dallas is a really strong defense when it comes to protecting the pass from a fantasy perspective. You're benching him, and you're still risking it with Shepard and Tate. On the Dallas side of the ball, New York Giants, they're really bad against the pass, so Amari Cooper, he's in line for a great game, top 5, and you should be excited about seeing him on Monday night. Michael Gallup, he's another great option. Start him as a wide receiver too, but realistically, just don't overthink it. Both of these guys, they're great options this week, and you don't really need to go further into it than that. But guys, that is going to be the end of the video here. We went through every matchup, and if you're still unsure who to start or injury updates do change these rankings, you can always see the updated information available on our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. We'll also update the comment pinned in the description. We'll have timestamps there as well. But if you did enjoy this video, please hit that like button. If you're new to the channel, hit that subscribe button. We thank you all for watching. Catch you on the next one.